Welcome to the next lecture in software design and modelling. Today we're going to talk some more about models in the design process. And mostly we're going to talk about allocating data and behaviour to classes, which is something that students often have trouble with. What typically happens is that you find it quite straightforward to identify a sensible collection of class names, but trying to do so in a way which actually supports implementing the required behaviour of the system can be a bit trickier. So today we're going to consider two useful techniques for this, and these things are supported by some of the required reading. We're going to talk about using CRC cards, but first of all we're going to talk about robustness analysis, and these are complementary techniques. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other. It's worth knowing something about both of them. Once you do understand the behaviour, which is to say how the objects of the various classes in your domain model, your conceptual class model, are going to cooperate in order to provide the required behaviour of the system, it is possible to record that behaviour in sequence diagrams in order to explain how the scenarios in the use cases actually play out. And we'll talk a little bit about why you might want to do that and some gotchas that stop you wasting a lot of effort on it towards the end. So robustness analysis systematizes the process of making the use case text and the conceptual class diagram consistent, and this helps you to move the conceptual class diagram on towards a design class diagram. So that's a class diagram that takes into consideration more of the design process, the process in which you decide how you're actually going to implement the behaviour that's necessary for this system, as opposed to just thinking about things which are true of the domain in general. And this deepens an idea that I think I already mentioned earlier on, which is to say that it's extremely useful to make sure that the terminology in your use case text and your conceptual class diagram are consistent. So when you use nouns and noun phrases in the use case text, they should correspond quite tightly to the specific names that you give the classes in your conceptual class diagram. But what we're talking about here is something more than that. We're talking about the process of being able to actually walk through the conceptual class diagram and see that things are connected in ways that will support the behaviour described in the use case text. So concretely what you do is, for each use case, you go through it sentence by sentence and you build a robustness diagram, as we'll see in a moment. And you'll find, typically, that you have to revise the use case text and the class model as you go, as necessary. And partly that's filling in more detail and adding things that accidentally got omitted earlier on, and sometimes it'll be clearing up inconsistencies and solving other problems. Now, although we're going to study robustness diagrams today, you should note that these are not an official part of UML. So robustness analysis was part of Ivar Jakobsen's process Objectory, which was one of the contributing sets of technology to UML, but it didn't make its way into UML proper. And I think perhaps the best way to think about this is to say that that's because robustness diagrams, as we'll see, maybe don't quite fit the criterion that we had earlier on for our models, that they should be first-class artifacts which were going to be preserved throughout the development process. Robustness diagrams rather, I think, have the property that you find them useful to build in the process of refining the use case text and the conceptual class diagram. But once you've built the robustness diagram, you probably don't want to preserve and maintain it. It's probably served its purpose once you've got the use case text and the conceptual class diagram consistent. So that's probably why it didn't actually make it into UML, although I wasn't party to the discussions, I don't know for sure. So what is a robustness diagram? The best way to think about it is that it's an object picture of a use case. And let's look at the elements of it first of all. It has three different kinds of elements: boundary objects, entity objects, and controllers, shown by those three symbols there. So boundary objects are objects that are part of the boundary of the system. They support the interaction between your system, the system under development, and outside entities, for example, the humans or the other systems that have to interact with it. And so in particular, when we think about the interactions between actors and the system, which you're familiar with from thinking about use cases where actors are supported in carrying out various coherent units of functionality represented by use cases, actors will only ever communicate with boundary objects. So actors are not on this list of elements of a robustness diagram. That's because they are a standard part of UML and you're already familiar with them. But they also exist in robustness diagrams, and they are only ever connected to boundary objects. Okay. Entity objects are the things that are actually going to be instances of your conceptual classes. And so thinking about which entity objects you need is going to support you in checking whether your conceptual classes are as you want them to be. Controllers typically turn into messages in the end, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. These you can think of as being the things that correspond to verbs in the use case text, while boundary objects and entity objects correspond to different kinds of nouns, noun phrases. And so the fundamental rule of how you construct this object picture of a use case, this robustness diagram, is that you connect elements of these three different kinds, and no two nouns must ever be adjacent. Okay, so all the communication, all the behaviour, has to be represented by controllers. And you basically just go through it one use case sentence at a time, and we'll see how that works. Do note, robustness diagrams are informal and they're not part of UML. I already said part of this, and part of what follows from that is that you shouldn't worry about the detail. They're just one way to get to a clear, unambiguous set of use case descriptions, and a reasonable, complete enough conceptual class diagram. Also in the process, a list of the things corresponding to the boundary objects, the screens and the web pages that are needed. And what you're doing is you are now beginning to build a design of the functionality which will take you on towards a design class model. And the next stage can be a bit harder.